For the last 35 years or so, I was curator of Malacology at the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. And that museum contains or archives quite a number of important collections. And this afternoon, what I'd like to do is to talk about just one of those. This is the collection made by William Henry Benson. Now, given that he is, hang on.
Sorry.
Yeah. Given that he is not exactly a household name, my first job is to explain who on earth he was and what he found, where he found it, and so on. I also would like to discuss his malacological network. He developed quite an extensive network while he worked in India, and I'll hope to review that. There are particular problems relating to his collection, particular curatorial problems relating to his collection, and I'd like to say a little bit about some of those. And I'd like to talk about his legacy, the key people who came and worked in this field in what I call the last part of the golden age of malacology that ended almost exactly a century ago. Okay, some facts and figures about Benson himself. He was born in 1803 in the Channel Islands. He entered East India College, which is now called Hailbury, which was the establishment for civil servants who were destined to work for the East India Company. It was where they were trained. Training lasted for 2 years, after which they were expected to appear in India within 6 months of graduation. And that's indeed what Benson actually did. He arrived in Calcutta in 1821. He was in India for a number of years before he published his first article. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But his first article was published in 1829, and that I've taken as the opening of the golden age. Nothing much had been published before, but Benson is a pioneer in looking in particular at the land snails and aquatic snails of the Indian subcontinent. So he arrived in 1829 and spent the next 26 years traveling around India as a magistrate and a judge, basically dispensing justice and collecting molluscs. That was his life. He had to leave the East India Company rather prematurely in 1847 because he seems to have developed some disability. He was essentially lame, and it seems from the symptoms that he describes that he might well have contracted polio. So he was obliged to return to Europe, and in Europe, on his return, he spent quite a few years going around all the major spa towns in Europe, Cannes, Nice, Spa itself in Belgium. And he also lived for a bit in Malvern and eventually went to live in Cheltenham, which is where he died in 1870. His departure from India, in a way, was quite providential because 10 years after his departure, we had the Indian Rebellion, and people like Benson, sort of people in authority like Benson, often didn't survive that particular uprising. So he might well, neither he nor his collection might well have survived had he stayed. He published his last paper in 1865, the last of about 100. His collection eventually came to the University Museum of Cambridge, which is where I worked, and that's how I came across him. So that's essentially the background. Now, he lived at a time before there were many malacological societies, and so there was very little information about his background. But mercifully, the East India Company kept amazing records, and it's possible to piece together at least some of this background. These are two documents that are in the British Library. This relates to his application to go to East India College. The one on the left was written by Benson himself, and this is where he tells us where he was born and so on. In order to attend this college, you required testimonials from the great and the good. And on the right, you see a document that was signed by George Canning, who was at this time in charge of Indian affairs. He rose through the political ranks. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was in charge of the Foreign Office, and eventually was our Prime Minister. His term was the shortest tenure of any British Prime Minister. That was until the events of last October. So we can piece together some of his early life. So these positions were greatly sought after. They were quite well remunerated, and it enabled him to purchase a number of properties in India during his time there. And these pictures show a property called Rockville, which is, as you see now, derelict. But this is where Benson lived during the later part of his spell in India in the 1840s. It's now part of a private nature reserve, and he described quite a number of new molluscs from this locality. It's near Landau, up in the montane region in the north. That contrasts very markedly with the places that he lived when he returned to England. These are two residences in Cheltenham where he spent the last decade or so of his life, beautiful Georgian residences. It was very nice. So Queen's Parade, I've got a nice picture of Queen's Parade there. I'm very pleased that I've actually got a picture of that without a Harley Davidson parked outside, which was rather spoilt the whole ambience I was trying to convey. At this point, I was hoping to show you a picture of Benson himself. I've not managed to track one down, but I did manage to find his grave in Cheltenham Cemetery, and there it is. There were all sorts of interesting people also buried in Cheltenham Cemetery, including Brian Jones, the founder member of the Rolling Stones. So there was an interesting cemetery. So this shows Benson's publications by year. Notice the date on the far left of the graph is 1821, and that's the year that he arrived in India. So the first 8 years he was there without publishing anything. That is not because he was not collecting anything. We know from the dates attached to specimens that he was active in those years. It was simply that there was no publication outlet in India at that time. The president of the Asiatic Society of Bengal was a chap called Sir William Jones, who was very much opposed to publishing anything on zoology in those years until he left office. So 1829 is the opened up the floodgates for zoological publication. So that's really where I take the opening of the golden age. You see that he published something most years. These were often quite short articles, but he ceased publishing in 1865. That was the date of his last publication. So that for the last few years of his life, I think he was too infirm to do any more research. So where did he go? Well, he was working in India at a time before the Suez Canal was cut. That was in 1869. And I've highlighted some of the places where he stopped in bold. So the Cape Verde Islands, St. Helena. He stopped in South Africa, Mauritius. And so that was the routes that he went on. You will see various names of various species in the ocean there. These are planktonic mollusks that he caught in tow nets behind the ship. He was obviously a far better sailor than me. I've been seasick all the way, but he obviously was able to collect these tiny little planktonic mollusks, which at those locations. One other thing to point out on this map is the location of Qisan in China. He never visited Qisan, but he did a lot of work on a collection brought back there at the height of the First Opium War in 1840. And I'll say perhaps a little more about that later on. But the whole focus of his collection activities was the Indian subcontinent. And these maps show the coverage that he was able to attain. Quite wide coverage in India, including some areas in the north, which are quite hard to get to even today. He did visit Ceylon, as it was. You can see the density of coverage there, but those were recorded mainly by the Layard cousins. So these, as I say, the coverage that he obtained was was impressive and extensive, but he obviously had a lot of help. And I said I was going to mention his network. If these are names that are contained in the 100 or so papers that he published, these are the sources of his material. A lot of people there obviously just supplied him with 1 or 2 specimens, but there are some regular suppliers who provided him with a lot more. I mentioned the Qisan collection that was made by Theodore Cantor, who is better known perhaps as a herpetologist. This is the chap who described the king cobra, for example, first chap who named that. So there are 58 different sources listed there. The other point to notice is, so these all relate to species that Benson described himself. Notice that Benson comes in at number 2. It's actually William Theobald who provided him more of these new species than he was able to collect himself. So perhaps this is just an extension of the Theobald collection in a sense. So his network then, they included household servants. We know that some of these were paid. It was obviously part of the domestic duties of the household. He dragooned family members. He had 2 sons and a daughter who were both thanked in various papers, and his son-in-law Richard Sankey, after whom he named several taxa. There were many members of the Bengal Medical Service, a lot of doctors. Thomas Jerden, whose name might be known to you, is a botanist and also very interested in birds. There are birds, mammals and plants named after him. Cantor I've already mentioned, and John Pearson was a curator. He published a few papers on mollusks, but not a major figure. There were other sort of missionaries who Benson knew and who provided him with material. Various people in the military, there's some listed there, as well as some fellow naturalists, in particular Frederick and Edgar Layard, who achieved great coverage in Ceylon when they were living there. And the other main group of people who he interacted with were members of the Geological Survey of India. Now, this didn't exist while Benson lived in India. It was only founded in 1851, but there are many people who belong to the Geological Survey who are interested in malacology. And on the bottom right, there is a famous photograph taken just after 1870 that shows some of the members there. On the far left, with the green star above him, is Ferdinand Stoliczka. So he died rather tragically a few years after that photograph was taken. He died of altitude sickness on an expedition in the Himalaya. And the one to the right of him, again with the green star, that is indeed William Theobald, who was a major figure at this time, because it was Theobald who wrote Conchologica Indica with Sylvanus Hammerly. There's a work you may well know. The chap I've indicated with the red star wasn't really a malacologist, but he was Henry Benedict Medlicott, and the name might not be familiar, but you'll certainly know what he did. He actually introduced the term Gondwana into the geological literature in the 1870s. So the point I want to make here is that the members of this geological survey, this was not just a straightforward routine mapping unit. These were people who were proposing some very serious ideas, both in geology and in natural history. I mean, Theobald himself published on botany, and he was quite a distinguished herpetologist as well. So a really interesting group of people. Not present on that photograph are the two people to the left. These are the Blandford brothers. These were, again, these were trained geologists. They were trained at the Royal School of Mines, as indeed was I, but they were based in Jermyn Street rather than the Prince Consort Road round the corner, which is where I was many, many years later. So Henry Blandford and William Blandford were, as you see, both Fellows of the Royal Society, very distinguished scientists. Henry became effectively the head of the meteorological service in India. He was very interested in the link between snowfall in the montane regions and rainfall in the lowlands, and he was very interested in that. William Blandford was a very, very distinguished geologist. They both, in the early days, sent specimens to Benson for description, but from the 1860s, they began to publish descriptions of them themselves. William Blandford would have been taught, or they both would have been taught, by people like Henry de la Beach, Lyon Playfair, and particularly Edward Forbes, who perhaps was the founder of the subject that we would now call biogeography. And it was for that William Blandford got the Royal Medal of the Royal Society for his work on the distribution of animals. William Blandford was also instrumental in setting up the Fauna of British India series. This was a monumental publication that ran multi-volume. It began publication in the 1880s and was still, I think the last volumes were published in the 1960s, publishing on different groups of animals that occur in British India. Before he died, he wrote a volume on the mammals and on the birds, and was well on the way to writing one on land snails, but he died before that was completed. And it was this chap, Henry Havisham Godwin Austen, who, right? It was Godwin Austen who actually was given the task of completing the volume that was begun by William Blandford. Now, Godwin Austen deserves a few comments of his own. He was, again, like Benson, a major figure in Asian malacology. He was a former president of this society. He was president of the Conchological Society in 1908 and 1909. He was an extraordinary character. He not unlike the Blandfords, was not a trained geologist. He was trained, he went to Sandhurst, so he had a military background, and he went to work for the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, which he joined formally in the 1856. So he was described as perhaps the finest mountaineer of his day. He discovered all sorts of, or he fixed the positions and heights of all sorts of mountains in the Himalaya, including the one you see on the right. This is K2, the mountain that once bore his name. K2, as you know, is the second highest mountain in the world. On many old maps, you will see it's called Mount Godwin Austen after him. But when the decision was made not to name mountains after in the post-colonial period, or even during the latter part of that, they didn't have a local name for it. So we still use the temporary name K2. There were something like a couple of dozen Ks, K1 to K20 something, that were finally given names, but K2, surprisingly, is still called by this temporary name. So his father was a very distinguished geologist. He, for example, was the person who predicted the occurrence of coal in Kent, that finally gave rise to the Kent coalfield. He did a lot of work on the raised beaches in southern England and so on. So certainly his father taught him quite a lot about geology. And Godwin Austen realized the significance of finding small marine fossils of Eocene age at high elevations in the Himalaya as a way of calibrating the uplift of the Himalaya. So he was interested in these sorts of issues. He had very broad interest in natural history. He was also interested in birds and so on. But his particular passion was, of course, land snails. And it's really, there's a very nice biography there written by Catherine Moorhead. She focuses rather more on his mountaineering exploits, but there's quite a lot of information there about his private life. So this is a diagram showing the discovery of species that were made by Godwin Austen. You can see that he began publishing more or less at the period where Benson ceased. So, as I say, Benson's last paper, and it was 1865. So Godwin Austen, there's a little bit of overlap between them, but really these are two different generations. And you can see that the number of species that were described by Godwin Austen reaches almost 1,000 there. So he was a very important figure. There were, so Godwin Austen and Blandford, so Godwin Austen completed Blandford's monograph that was published obviously after Blandford's death. But there were two other volumes of the Fauna of British India series that were devoted to land snails. And these were not, well, Godwin Austen was not asked to do that. And he was not happy about it, as you can see. In a rather scathing review in Nature, published in 1921, he writes, well, with more than 40 years connection with these land operculates, both in the field and in collections, he was in complete ignorance that such a volume was under compilation. You can feel the indignation. And his frustration is really quite understandable. He had spent 40 years collecting these specimens, and Gude had never set foot in India, didn't know anything about those. And of course, Godwin Austen did a lot of work on the anatomy, looking at the detailed relationships that you can derive from looking at anatomical details. Gude concentrated entirely on the shells. So you can see that there was a problem there. So Gude published the last two volumes. He died, Godwin Austen died in 1823. Gude died the year after. And with their deaths, the golden age came to an end, as I say, almost exactly 100 years ago. Quite why Godwin Austen wasn't given the job. Perhaps he was too old, perhaps he was too slow, perhaps he just didn't get on with the editors, but for whatever reason, Gude was asked to complete. Back to Benson then. So this table gives a breakdown of the taxa that Benson described. I think there was 471, this is a slightly old table, 471 taxa in all. Most of them, as you see, there are pulmonates. There are, well, you can see the breakdown of the other groups. So there's some quite a number of operculates in the first two columns. The non-pulmonate heterobranchs are those sort of planktonic species that he dredged en route on the ocean voyages. So that's the number, and you can see most of them come from the Indian subcontinent, from what was called British India. So that included India, Burma, and so on. So that's the geographical focus, and that's the sort of taxonomic focus. He also described, as well as those 470 odd species, he also described 32 new genera, and about over 100 of these taxa have been designated the type species of genera described by others. There are a lot of synonyms, of course, and there are probably over 72 species are probably synonyms, but that's probably an underestimate. We'll know more when a full revision is undertaken. Now, when Benson began his work, he undertook a review of the collections held by the Asiatic Society of Bengal. Those collections were moved to the Indian Museum there in Calcutta, where they were catalogued by Geoffrey Neville and in two handbooks. And you can see the title page of one of those there. Those remained in the Indian Museum until 1916, when they were moved to the Zoological Survey of India. I should add that Neville's handbook is much more than it seems. He describes new genera in there and new taxa in there. It's not simply just a list of species, it's much more than that. The East India Company also had a museum in Leadenhall Street in London, where regular consignments were sent, where they were received by the curator, Thomas Horsfield, whose picture you can see there. That remained there until the East India Society were liquidated in 1858, the year following the Indian Rebellion. And those collections were then moved to the British Museum in Bloomsbury, and then to the building where we are now. So that if you find Horsfield's name in the museum catalogues, you know that it must have come via that route, via the East India Museum in Leadenhall Street. As I say, the East India Company keeps the most extraordinary records, including the lists of some of these consignments. On the left is a list of snails that were sent back by Benson himself. That's Benson's handwriting. And on the right are a list of snails that were collected on Kusan, this Chinese site collected by Theodore Cancel. So these records exist, and they're very important in trying to track the provenance of specimens and trying to ensure that these really arose from Benson and really could be regarded as a syntype. So I began this project, I suppose, over 2 decades ago. We've managed to find about over 90% of the taxa that were described by Benson. About 1/5 of them were present in the building here. So they've remained here, as I say, since they were transferred from Leadenhall Street. I don't know how much longer they will remain in this building. They are likely to be moved out to a store in Reading in the next few years, so watch this space. On the right is a picture of the University Museum of Zoology before its redevelopment. That's what it looked like when I began this work. There's something like over 70% of Benson's species were present there. Now, on the bottom right, it was my predecessor as the curator of Malacology in Cambridge, Martin Bishop. Some of you may remember him. And he started the work on the Benson collection by separating out Benson species from the main collection and putting them in those drawers that you see there labeled potential types. And frankly, I didn't think I would be able to do very much more with these collections. I have no experience, or had no experience of Indian malacology. This wasn't my field at all. And it was really as a result of prompting from the two people on the left, one of whom I think is listening to me speaking now. I got requests to borrow material to illustrate various identification guides and identification sheets. And it seemed to us a good idea that, wouldn't it be a good idea to put all this together, all the Benson things, in one big volume? Well, little did I know how much work that actually entailed. But anyway, that's where the collections are, and those are the people, a lot of the main people who got this kick started. Benson's collection was acquired by Robert McAndrew. Robert McAndrew, most of the mollusk collection in Cambridge was amassed by this chap, Robert McAndrew. He was quite a wealthy ship owner, and he was a very keen exponent of the dredge. His collection contains material that he dredged from his own boats in the Western Atlantic, off Norway, off Madeira, and in the Mediterranean. He also made an important collection in the Gulf of Suez in the same year that the Suez Canal was opened. So that's quite an important collection if you're looking at migrations between the Gulf of Suez and the Mediterranean. He was wealthy enough to purchase other important collections, including that of William Benson. Although quite how, the exact circumstances of how he acquired Benson's collection, I'm afraid I haven't quite got to the bottom of, nor have I got to the bottom of how much Sylvanus Hanley, what the valuation he put on that collection, although he was asked to value it. I haven't actually found a figure. So Robert McAndrew himself died not long after he acquired Benson's collection. So Benson died in 1870, McAndrew died in 1873, and it was bequeathed to the University Museum in Cambridge in that year. One other thing to point out is that the spelling of McAndrew's name, Robert McAndrew actually spelled it MC, not MAC. And it was his son George who added the A so that trading partners would know how to pronounce their name. And the other thing about McAndrew is the fact that his son George owned Juniper Hall, who I know, June, you've done a lot of work there. That would, his son, well, it'll be in the early part of the 20th century, perhaps, or late 1890s, perhaps, something like that. I can't tell you exactly, but anyway, that's where he lived. So there are a lot of problems attached to Benson's work. Part of Benson's descriptions were typically brief. They were short. They were in Latin, and almost invariably without any illustration at all, and that made it very difficult to know what he was actually talking about. And of course, he didn't really designate types. That had not become a sort of expected thing to do. So one of the great problems associated with the Benson collection was the loss of documentation. And this is something that Godwin Austen first pointed out when he wrote, when he was writing to the director of the museum in Cambridge. He writes, "I regretted to find Benson's original labels in his unmistakable writing have been destroyed, and with them his valuable record of exact locality. This fault, however, does not rest, I am glad to say, on the Cambridge Museum." So I'm glad to put that in there. So yes, so what happened was that McAndrew relabeled everything with his characteristic label with the sort of double ruled lines around it. Godwin Austen pointed the finger very much at Sylvanus Hanley as the main person that degraded this information. Hanley, it has to be said, was more interested in collecting shells. The details of exact localities were not something that really troubled him. In saying it came from India was good enough. And many of these localities, which I mean, I'm sure Benson would have recorded in great detail where he found them, they were just degraded to Ind, as you see in that label. The other thing that happened with many of MacAndrew's specimens of Benson material was that he glued everything onto these strips of blue card. Some of them obviously became detached, as you see there, but there were also several other unforeseen circumstances. Here is syntypes of species that Benson described. The glue obviously provided great nourishment for that fungus that has covered that specimen on the left. I've never actually seen that before. But MacAndrew also kept his collection in not in acid-free conditions. He had oak cabinets and so on. And this is a problem that can happen with shell collections of this date, so these are two shells that were collected from Kusan. They were stuck on the card. They're only a few millimeters apart, one of which is still in good condition, and the one on the right is showing signs of Beinesian decay. Bynes actually described this effect in the Journal of Conchology, I think in some of the very early volumes he described this problem. So all of the MacAndrew collection were moved out of the original cabinets even before my time. So they've been stored in better. Now, I mentioned that a lot of Benson's original documentation and labels were disposed of. Some original labels survive, as this one. This was survived by being crumpled up and stuffed into the aperture. Despite being rather inelegant, it actually contains all the information that you would hope. The name, where it came from, and in this instance, it says type specimen. So if everything was labelled like that, we'd have finished this project absolutely years ago. But of course, that isn't the case. One of the main components of this project was to try and evaluate which specimens, or whether these specimens actually form part of the type series or not. And part of that evaluation, we used these 4 criteria. So does the specimen actually match the original description? That actually sounds a bit basic, but we have found instances where clearly there's been a muddle, and that isn't the case. Are the number and conditions of the specimens actually consistent? Sometimes you find that Benson described something from a single shell, and we actually find that there's half a dozen now in the collection. So there are issues there. So material has been added later. Does it come from the type locality? And is it unequivocally part of the Benson collection or collected by someone named in the original description? These were the main criteria that we used. And here are some of the problems. So on the top left there is a very fine specimen. There's a label there that was said to be a type by Blandford, as you see. But Blandford clearly hadn't done his homework, because if he had, he would have seen that Benson described this from a single shell that had apertural damage. The one that he claims to be a type is absolutely perfect. But the one on the right there, you can see it does have apertural damage, and that, I think, is consistent with Benson's description of the only specimen that he had at that time. With the Megalomastoma gravidum, Benson described this species, and he makes it quite clear in the description that none of the specimens that he had at the time of the description had an operculum. They were collected dead. Every specimen in the collection in Cambridge has an operculum and was obviously collected alive, so none of them can have formed part of the type series. So that specimen there, which was designated as a lectotype, is obviously that's invalid, because it you can only designate a lectotype from syntypes, and those are clearly not syntypes. And the final problem there relates to the corbicula there. That's Hanley's label that says that the top specimen was part of the types. I found buried away in a paper describing material in Harvard that that bottom one was designated as a lectotype. I'm not sure that those are the same thing, but that's a problem for another day. There are also problems with localities. Those of you who read your Stephen Jay Gould would know that Syrian, was a species he wrote a lot about, occurs exclusively in the Caribbean area. It has no business coming from China. It's not otherwise completely unknown in China. And Benson simply accepted the locality that he was told. He didn't know any better. So that was a locality error that goes right the way back to the time of the original description. Other errors have clearly been introduced later. The specimen on the right is described with the type locality is Cherrapunji in India, and yet the label written out or rewritten by McAndrew clearly says China, and he's obviously can't read or is mistaken Benson's handwriting. Cherra, he's mistaken Cherra for China. So there are errors like that which also exist. So we've had one or two sort of champagne moments, one or two things that for years their identity was not known. These are two species that were found in Australia from the Swan River. That's what the label says. And they were always thought to be land snails. And they've always been put down. No one really knew what they were, but I've managed to find them. It's clear that they're not land snails at all, but are marine species. It's very important that that sort of information gets widely distributed, and Mollusca baits is a very good way of doing that. And I'm very heartened to see that our attribution of these to this marine genus Circulus has been picked up there, and you can see the basis on which that revision has been made. Now, some of these species are extremely small. Some of them really can pass through the eye of a needle. This is a species that was described by Benson from moss that was used to pack rather bigger shells. Turns out that this is now been recently attributed to a new genus, and earlier this year, Barna Palgagili has described, I think, over 42 additional species belong to this genus. So it was clearly quite a common thing that lives amongst moss in tropical forest. Now, tropical snails are eaten by all sorts of predators. It's not very nice being a snail in a tropical forest because all sorts of things eat you. And there have been all sorts of defense strategies that have been developed to try and counteract this. This is a species that Benson described, an Analicas. I love this thing. It's got the most extraordinary convoluted peristem, thickened, presumably to avoid being nibbled at by some nasty arthropod. There's a great rib that will presumably prevent the sclerotized head of some arthropod gaining access to the interior. And there's a constriction behind that. So all sorts of ways of trying to prevent entry, as well as of course, having an operculum that you can close once you've retracted yourself into the shell. But if you are hunkered down in a shell, that's great, the predators can't get at you, but you have another very serious problem to overcome, and that is that you've got to breathe. And that's what this sutural tube is all about. You can see it up there. It was thought that this was just a thinner part of the shell and air diffused into it and thence through a hole and into the cavity of the shell, enabling the animal to breathe. Turns out things are much more interesting than that. This again is work that Barner has done, where there's a whole series of microchannels that lead from the umbilical area over around the periphery of the shell onto the suture and into that sutural tube. So there's a really quite a sophisticated ventilation system that we knew nothing about, and you can see the reference where you can read more about that. There are all sorts of other breathing structures in many of these tropical land snails. Some of them have little slits, you see, or little notches, or little tubes. But clearly some of them just don't pack it. That's just not good enough. They have a snort. So this is Rhizostoma, which is a species that Benson described. One of the snorkel snails. In the bottom one, the snorkel is straight, and the top one is bent, all the better for keeping out small predatory arthropods. And of course, you see irregular coiling in a whole range of different mollusk groups. So the aperture can come to sit on the same plane as the apex, and so on. So these are some of the wonders of nature, as far as I'm concerned. They're really beautiful things. The most extreme of all is Whittinia, named after Tony Whitten, who many of you may remember. He was killed rather tragically on his bike on the way home from our department about 5 years ago. That has no less than 4 axes of coiling, which you can see there. And I think these are all devices to try and prevent predators gaining access. Many of these beautiful little snails, they're very small, many of these, are threatened. There's great conservation concern. They're threatened not by climate change or anything like that. They're threatened because quarrying activities are simply removing the limestone hills on which these animals evolved. And I really hope that we can save them. So those were some of the scenic gastropods. You can also see anti-predator devices in many of the pulmonates. So the top one, you can see the aperture and the apex on the same plane. On the bottom right is Bensonella, named after Benson. You can fill your aperture with teeth and prevent animals from entering, or predators entering that way. There's one species, or more than one species of Bensonella, where the teeth are actually hooked, very savage-looking hooks there. So all sorts of ways to keep out intruders. Now, looking at many of these specimens are often rather brown, rather drab, and they don't look terribly exciting. And they really don't prepare you for the full magnificence of the living animal. This is Indrella, which is a monotypic genus that lives in the Western Ghats. It's endemic to the Western Ghats. These 2 colour morphs, in fact, there are 3 colour morphs. There's a red morph as well. The orange one and the yellow one live sympatrically. You can find them in mixed populations. And they occur in the northern part of the Western Ghats. The red form occurs in the southern part. And there's some interesting new molecular phylogenetic work published in the latest issue of the Biological Journal of the Linnean Society that actually goes into the significance of these colour morphs. They are indeed colour morphs of one species and nothing more than that. They also don't prepare you for some of the behaviour that some of these snails exhibit. Benson tells us that Dergella salius, now Dergella, this species looks like a rather overgrown vitrinid, rather large thing, that's what it looks like. He tells us that it can jump several inches into the air as some sort of escape response. I can't begin to imagine how it actually does this. I'd pay good money to see it, though. I just can't. I can't get my head around that. But it does. And Benson also described another species. He didn't call it Quantula striata. There's a synonym that he described. And that is actually bioluminescent. It actually emits light. And when I started this, I had no idea that snails could jump, let alone emit light. So it's been an interesting learning experience. We don't know, because Benson was doing this so long ago and things have changed so much in India, I've no idea how many of his taxa still survive. I think looking at the photograph I showed you where he lived in the mountains, the habitats still look pretty good, and I'm quite confident that these things still live there. But I can't say that for some of the rivers and some of the lowland habitats. We can be a little bit more certain when it comes to island context. This is the maps show Mauritius, and it shows the cover of forest cover on Mauritius at various dates. So when Benson was there in the 1830s, so that's the second map along from the left, there was over 50% forest cover. Now you can see, well, in 1997, there was less than 2% indigenous forest remaining. And needless to say, some of these have become extinct on Mauritius. Ripta setilaris has gone from Mauritius. It still lives on one of the other islands. The middle one, we don't need to bother with the names, but the middle one is now critically endangered. And I'm afraid that the one on the left is probably now extinct. So that's the sad tale there. So this is the product, the final outcome of the work that we've done on Benson. It's published online in Tropical Natural History, but there are hard copies, some of which I put out at the back. So this monograph, it provides a history of malacology during the golden age, between sort of 1820s and 1920s. It includes a biography of Benson, together with many of his malacological contacts. There's over 50 pages devoted to that history. We also illustrate all of the types, or all of his species that we've been able to track. Many of them are obviously going to form part of the type series. So there's something like 2,500 images of his species. And all of the localities we've been able to georeference with coordinates. So we've been doing a lot of work trying to find out where these sites actually are. We're also in this revision tried to highlight some of the curatorial problems that have been associated with Benson's collection. And we hope that this provides an important foundation. It's not a revisionary work. We didn't set out to do that, but we hope this provides a foundation for such a revisionary work by illustrating material that form the type series of species that live in India and elsewhere. So it just remains for me to thank the funders. So the Isaac Newton Trust provided some funding in the early years. The Malacological Society kindly paid for the production of about 200 hard copies, which are on sale here. I need to thank my co-authors who are listed there. Hilary Ketchum is now in the American Museum of Natural History, and who else is there? Tom White, of course, did a huge amount of work with me. I couldn't have done it without him. Fred Naggs, of course, and Dinazar Rahim, and a special thanks, and of course John Ablett, I think was the last author, and Harry Taylor and Kevin Webb are the photographers. They work in the photographic unit of this museum, and they worked overtime to produce what I think are some really nice images of these important specimens. So a special thanks to them. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Can we go back on the more screen? I think that's a fascinating talk. It just shows the abilities of some of these old malacologists in collecting. I can't see this kind of thing happening nowadays with habitats changing so much, and there's less dedication, I think, probably on many areas. And it shows also what can be done with commitment to keeping these things up to date, cataloguing them, analysing them, assessing them. And I think you're lucky, perhaps, that such a large portion of this collection is still extant. So many major collections of the past no longer exist. So, have we got any questions that people would like to put? None?
Perhaps I might just have a tiny coda.
Yeah.
I don't mean going off on a slightly different subject.
If you shout, then people might hear. So.
Okay. Last spring, I bought in a book which was by Benson, who did it when he was very young. It's a natural history book. One chapter was chronological, and he became Archbishop of Canterbury towards the end of the 19th century. He had a very famous family of writers who had certain Irish elements, you know, but. I looked up the Benson family on the internet, so there was a William Benson, but it wasn't our one. But it said that the family was large and very distinguished in many fields. So I'm going to just keep the name in mind and see if I can find some more Bensons and how they're related to each other, if anyone else happens to see another.
Well, a lot of his family remained in India. So his sons, his youngest son, I think, stayed in India and had lots of daughters. I don't think there were men. That always makes genealogy difficult. And of course, a lot of the records probably will be lost in India after the rebellion. So it's difficult. But so yes, I haven't been able to track the members of the current Benson family. So it'd be nice if we could.
I think it was very nice to hear a little bit about Godwin Austen, who was president of our society in 1908 to 1910. And at this very moment, there's a conference going on in India, the Asian Malacological Conference, which is in his memory. And I'm pleased to say that our society has offered some sponsorship for prizes for papers given both oral papers and posters at that meeting. So
yeah, I meant to say that and give that a plug. That's happening next week. Yes.
Next week.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you.
I also noticed that a Bland turned up on the list of the people he was connected with. The original collection of Reading Town Museum was made by a chap called Horatio Bland, who was a local town dignitary, really quite wealthy, did a lot of travelling, and he left a worldwide shell collection and also ethnological collection. He lived just outside Reading. I'm wondering if there's any connection with
it's William Bland. There were two Blands. William Bland was our person was the surgeon on a ship's surgeon on a boat. So it's not the same person, but I don't know whether there's a connection.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ben, you had a query?
Yeah, hello. Thanks, that was brilliant, Richard. I really enjoyed that. And I don't even know the first thing about Benson or Indian snails, but every time I hear about it, I learn a lot more. So that was really good. And I don't know if you or anyone knows the answer to this, but the snails with the snorkel tubes and other breathing adaptations. We put one of those out on Twitter not very long ago, and some smart Alex said, well, how do the other snails survive without these snorkels then? And it just left us gasping for air. We didn't know the answer. Does anyone know why some snails need to evolve these breathing things to breathe from behind their aperture? And if they can't breathe, there's like is asphyxiation a big cause of death for terrestrial operculates or what?
Well, you ask a very good question. Does anyone have an answer to that? Why doesn't Prometheus elegans
Oh.
ever? Go on, Fred's waving his finger. Go on. You have to unmute yourself, Fred.
Fred?
Yeah, he's unmuted.
I have an answer.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Go on.
You're keeping us in suspense, Fred. We can't hear you. No, you've frozen, Fred. I mean, it's we're all on tenterhooks here, waiting to hear these pearl of wisdom. We'll never know.
No, I think he's lost the connection somehow.
Anyone else have a suggestion then? I mean, Fred, obviously. All right.
One problem is when you have the aperture uppermost, like a nice little trumpet upsended, but what happens when it rains?
Well, they get wet. I mean,
There's your operculum.
Yeah.
You could close the operculum if the shell has one. I was wondering whether the snorkel tubes were needed because it's an awful lot hotter. And they're also acting as ventilators
Yeah.
for the shell when the operculum is closed. And the animal may also, if it's hotter, have a higher requirement for oxygen.
could be. But Fred's got the answer. Where is he still not? All right.
He's gone.
Oh, he's probably trying to come back in, is he?
He may come back, I don't know. No.
Root, do you have an idea of what answer to that question?
To be honest, Richard, I have no idea whatsoever. No, it's a very good question, and I never thought about it. Yes, I just want to say, by the way, it was a marvelous lecture, and the book that you produced with the other authors is a magnificent piece of work, one of the best works I've ever seen on terrestrial mollusks.
Well, that's very kind of you to say that. Have you got your copy in from Leiden?
I have my copy from Leiden, indeed. Yes.
Excellent.
Fred is back.
Oh, Fred is back. Right. Where's the answer then?
Oh, I
Right.
keep
We've
losing the
been waiting
connection.
here.
No, if you creep up on a cyclothorid whilst it's inactive and the operculum appears closed, it's actually gaping slightly. And the slightest disturbance and it clams shut again. So they don't actually have an operculum that's locked onto the aperture. Most of the time it's gaping, and that's how they are able to breathe.
Right. Thank you for that, Fred. That's very good. What do I got to give this?
Okay,
Right.
some of our members are having to leave in order to get home with the train problems at the moment.
It's for those people who are abroad. We're suffering industrial action on the trains today, and we're a bit depleted here, and we've got to get back by the last train. But anyway, I can't get this on. Keep going. Any other questions? Oh,
Well, I think it just is up to me to thank Richard again very much for that very stimulating talk. It made me realise, being one of the people who studied British non-marine mollusks, how boring they are in comparison. At least the numbers are more manageable. So thank you very much, Richard. Can we give him a round of applause?